Welcome back, everyone, to week 7 of Liberation Music Therapy series. This presentation is number 7 in the entire series, and tonight we're going to be connecting interpersonal, organizational, and political forms of control. It's not meant to sensationalize, but it's meant to recognize patterns early before harm escalates. So tonight's focus is the sixth spoke of the praxis wheel, which is educational practices, transformational practices. It's a big topic, and I felt it was important to divide into 3 distinct sections. So this is the first of those 3 sections, which is high control dynamics and fascism. Next week, we're going to be doing caste and class, and then the week after that, we're going to be doing pedagogy of the oppressed. Today is split into 2 parts, high control dynamics and understanding fascism. And the through line is power, how it's organized, how it's justified, and even how it's resisted, which when you're in it, it is harder, it's easier said than done, as I think many people are noticing. Part 1, high control dynamics. And this is really starting at the relational level. So what exactly are high control dynamics? High control dynamics describe how power is enforced, how autonomy is eroded, and how dependency is intentionally created. These patterns, they show up in cults, they show up in abusive relationships, they show up in workplaces, they show up in families, they show up in states, they show up in companies, they show up in daycares, they show up in gymnastic studios, they show up in Boy Scouts of America, they show up in the Catholic Church, they show up in the Southern Baptist Convention, they show up in the Mormon Church, they show up all over the place. And it's something that, as you start to become aware of high control dynamics, it does exist on a spectrum, and we do have to take time in addressing people. Sometimes a person, and I'm telling this from the perspective of working inside prisons, sometimes a person can be doing antisocial things or engaging in antisocial behavior, even engaging in high control dynamics, putting high control dynamics upon another person, but they are still healable. So we do need to be mindful in how we walk some of this. But that being said, some of the extreme cases are just very, very challenging to work through. The most extreme cases are situations like Keith Raniere and the Nexium cult, or Charles Manson and his cult, or Jim Jones, or Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, these types of folks. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Peter Thiel. There's a particular type of person that is very challenging to work with, and I don't know how to address necessarily healing a person with those circumstances. So this is really more about behavior, addressing people's behavior patterns. If a person is, this is a way to identify abusive behavior and why people stay within abusive behavior. Controlling behavior. This is behavior that is about gaining and maintaining control or maintaining power over a person, a people, or situation. It happens through coercion, through reinforcement, through manipulation, various control tactics. It's important that the goal is loyalty, obedience, and dependency, all at the expense of autonomy. So this is not about bad individuals. This is about systems of control. So I am imagining, I do not want to assume, but I am imagining as I'm speaking about controlling behavior, there are people in your life that may be coming into mind who exhibit some of these traits. And that is because this behavior is common. And it is on a spectrum. Again, it's on a continuum of severity. But it does not change the fact that this is identifiable behavior. So, common dynamics that happen within high control dynamics. I'm going to just read them aloud, but then I'll explain what they are. It's totalism, in-group, out-group mentality, dichotomous thinking, also what we would call black and white thinking, and cognitive dissonance. Now, totalism, this is the concept of total control over behavior and beliefs. It is that you see the world this way. And just to explain that we all have elements of totalism in the way we view the world. If you have any kind of religious or spiritual identity on how you perceive the world, that is a totalistic way of viewing something. But what we're talking about when we get to totalism is the inability to leave your comfort or leave your ideas or ideology, the inability to empathize with another. So that is what we mean when we say totalism, when a person can just not relate to somebody outside of their worldview that they are in. The second dynamic, in-group, out-group mentality. This is dehumanization of outsiders. And I have no love for the Democrats. I want to be very clear with y'all. I am not a proud Democrat or anything like that in my life. But the way that Donald Trump is speaking right now about the Democrats and the left as a blanket statement is this exactly. In-group, out-group mentality. There are only Democrats on the Epstein list, according to him. And only Republicans are not on the Epstein list, according to him. And I'm relating this to current events just because it is relatable. But these dynamics happen many a place. I remember when I was being raised Christian, I once asked a Sunday school teacher, what is a Catholic? I was like 12, something like that. And I asked, what is a Catholic? And my teacher responded with, it doesn't really matter. They're not Christians anyway. And I was a child, and I remember thinking, okay, like, I know they're not like what we are, but like, that doesn't sound right at all, like what you just said. I mean, this is just in my mind, but I really do consider that one of the first cracks of me being like, what is this world I live in? But that is in-group, out-group mentality. Dichotomous thinking. This is a tendency to evaluate situations and experiences as mutually exclusive, binary categories, rather than falling along a continuum. Something good happens in your life. It is because you prayed to the right God. Or something bad in your life happens, and it is because of a specific action that you did, and now you're facing consequences for it. Life is just not so dichotomous. And one thing, and this is slightly controversial, though I feel comfortable enough saying it because I work in the field enough, there is an issue within high control groups of people with autism or people who are neurodivergent falling into these groups, specifically because of the dichotomous thinking element. And this is that and I want to be clear that I 100% stand by neurodiverse inclusion as well as neurodiverse affirming practices and everything that is involved with that. But it was brought to my attention by a survivor of cults who is also an academic, who is also on the spectrum, and this is where their work is oriented. Their name is Gwyneth Kikawa. If you ever check them out, they're doing musical theater study on cult recovery. It's very, very cool, very interesting. But anyways, they brought up the point that it's like, yes, of course, when you are on the spectrum or you have a neurodivergent way of seeing and processing the world, of course you can live a completely full life, and that is not a hindrance. But if you also have trouble reading social cues and there is an active predator putting things out intentionally, it can be very easy to fall into dichotomous thinking. And so, yeah, this is something where it hasn't been studied enough to make any firm claims about neurodivergency and falling into high control groups and high control dynamics. There's a lot more complications to it than simply the way a person processes, but it is something that is noticeable enough from people within the community, myself included. Cognitive dissonance, and this is holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time. There is a theoretical orientation within liberation psychology on what happens when a person commits an act of violence, and it's a two splitting that takes place when a person commits an act of violence. So if a person is punching somebody for the first time, two things happen. The first is a cognitive dissonance is created. You begin to justify why the act of violence was necessary. This has been seen in soldiers who have committed acts of violence. This has been seen in gang members who have committed acts of violence. This has been seen in domestic violence committers. There is always a self-justification by the perpetrator, and that is where cognitive dissonance plays a role. But the second piece when an act of violence is committed is also learning. Once your body has committed that act, it is now easier to do it a second time because your body now has to do it, now knows how to do it. The nervous system knows how to process it and do it that way, so you don't think as much. And so when we get to the much worse, horrifying content of next week of genocide, there is discussion of the genocidaires and what goes on through their minds and their bodies psychologically when they commit these horrific acts. Because most people are not sociopaths. Most people are not. And yet many of us are capable of committing sociopathic acts if we are put in some say the right circumstance, but I would say the wrong circumstance. A common structure that is identifiable in high control dynamics, it's a 5-point structure, and there's basically top leaders, sub leaders, core enforcers or core members, rank and file members, and fringe members. And I'll break this down in a couple of ways to apply it to different groups. But if you have ever been involved in a church, the core members are the lay leaders or the very pious members. They are dedicated to the mission of the church. They are there. You go to their house, you see everything up in their house. It's all church everything. So those are the core members. The rank and file members are those people's kids. Like they like the spouse who's not as involved, but like they go because they go. So that's the rank and file members. The fringe members are the Easter and Christmas folks. Now going to the other way, the sub leaders, that's the administrators, that's the the musicians, the other folks who work in the church. Then the top leaders, that's the boss, that's the pastor. And so that's one way to look at how this structure might apply in that sort of space. But now let's look at it through, let's say, a multi-level marketing lens. A core member would be somebody who is just so committed to selling you essential oils. These essential oils are the best thing. In fact, I only use essential oils for cleaning myself now. there are people that get like this, where all of a sudden they find some product and they become completely committed to the product, to the thing that they're selling or the thing that they're buying into. That would be the core members. The rank and file membership of this like multi-level marketing concept, that would be the folks who are buying from the very dedicated, like, I'm committed to this product. So those are the people who are buying from that person and really not making any money. The fringe members are the people who maybe went to a meeting once, maybe went to a selling bid once, maybe bought a round of things once or twice, but didn't really commit, or didn't really even, like, they bought it and then didn't do anything. So now we go to the sub-leaders, which is all the way second to the top. Those are the people who run the website. They run the day-to-day operations, make sure the factory is running so everybody gets their essential oils that they need to sell through the multi-level marketing process. And then top leader, that's the person at the top who came up with this brilliant idea. Look at these oils. That's usually the name of the company, or the face of the company. But the point of this is that this applies to many, many, many structures. When I first started learning about cults, this was really one of the most helpful structures for me to identify real-world behavior patterns, especially in the prison structure, because I was on leave for about 3 months from my prison job due to an incident. I'll leave it at that. An incident happened, so I was on leave, and I was just chilling at home because it was workers' comp. And so I was watching a lot of cult documentaries, just like it was like I was getting paid and I was at home. It was great. And I ended up reading a couple books about cults. And there was one particular book called Take Back Your Life by Janja Lalich. And she breaks down a lot of the behavior patterns of cultic groups or high control groups. And it was the first time that I wasn't thinking of cults as a weird group of people who do strange things in white robes off in the middle of the woods, and started to realize that this is a structure of behavior that we're talking about. And so this structure, the common structure, top leaders, sub-leaders, core members, rank and file members, fringe members, this is exactly how gangs operate in the prison system. This is exactly how. So when I would have an issue, for instance, going into a place where none of the community members would engage with me for a couple of reasons, one of which me being a white person, one of which me being a person who works for the state or the system. Even if I'm coming in through a nonprofit organization, or I'm literally working through the state, doesn't matter. When you're actually in there, it just doesn't make a difference. When you're in those kinds of spaces, it's really important to pay attention to how people move and how people talk to each other, and figure out who is the top leader, who's actually at the top, who's making the calls. Figure that out. And oftentimes, this literally happened with one particular group where they would not communicate with me at all. It was a house at Rikers Island, all Bloods that lived there. Bloods is a gang here from LA as the originals, but there's a group here in New York. It's a whole other history. But anyways, no one would speak to me in this house at Rikers Island for like 3 or 4 weeks. And I finally figured out the gentleman who was the shot caller, who made all the decisions. And what I ended up doing was I would go up, I'd hand him the MP3 player and the speaker, and I'd just like leave it with him. And he would go through some songs. He'd like play 4 or 5 songs, and then he'd set it down and walk away. And then people would just like start walking up and talking to me. And it was like, oh, word. So this particular dynamic I found extremely helpful in the prison structure, because you can actually navigate. And keep in mind, these are not literal things. It's not like, oh, that person has core membership pin. Oh, they just must have moved up sub-leader. This is a framework to just conceptualize a leadership structure or a hierarchy structure within any kind of group, but especially a group that is showing high control dynamics. I experienced in real life a high control circumstance that did not go the worst, but it got very bad. But we had an extremely toxic choir director in a choir, and this person was actively spreading lies about other people in the choir and getting all this infighting going on. And years later, I'm now a working music therapist in cult recovery and learn these behavior patterns, and it's a playbook. It literally reads like a playbook. So something that happens in these high control dynamics or these high control relationships is something known as the cycle of abuse. And this is really a framework to identify events or the cycle of events. So high control systems, they often have a tension building moment, incident that occurs where stress and conflict gradually increase. And then there's the actual incident, which is an abusive event. Then reconciliation. This is where the abuser may seek to make amends or justify their action, just as we were speaking about in the last slide, or 2 slides ago. And then calm, a temporary period of peace that follows before the cycle begins again. Now, this can happen in short bursts. It can happen a lot. You can go through many, many, many cycles, or it can have a long process. But the point is that there is an identifiable behavior pattern of events. I have heard more than one story from survivors of domestic abuse who came to terms with the circumstance that they were living in, came out of their haze, if you will, after reading The Cycle of Abuse, just reading it, seeing it for the first time, and going, oh, I've been in that for 20 years. It happens. So the reason why the cycle of abuse works, and I am saying this not to encourage it, but the reason why this keeps people in a relationship or in a circumstance in which they should not be in is a term called trauma bonding. And now trauma bonding can happen in many, many different places. I know my experience in the military. I've experienced trauma bonding with some of my battle buddies from that world. Hard to explain what it is, but we are just tight. We're just tight. It's hard to explain. I don't know how to put my finger on it. I'll see these dudes in 20 years and we'll still know what we're talking about. Like that kind of thing. People that I thoroughly disagree with and actually like basically lost friendships with the last couple of years, I still have that military camaraderie. Even though I'm an active socialist and abolitionist and anti-military thinker, it's one of those pieces where there is trauma bonding in many, many circumstances. But trauma bonding, if you want to think about it, it's almost like a hardening and softening that strengthens the relationship bond. So it forms through intermittent reward and punishment. Basically a constant experiencing of fear and relief. And the fear is really tightening your entire body up, and the relief is releasing it. And this bonds resistance to change. So it confuses the body's survival with attachment. The reason why this creates a bond is that if you are completely exhibiting fear or only exhibiting fear, there is no moment of relief. There's no moment of relationship building. And this is one thing that I hate saying this out loud. This is why the content warning at the beginning, but Guantanamo Bay, there were circumstances of complete dehumanization of the people being tortured, and that only created fear in the torturees. Whereas there have been other examples of torturers feeling serious conflict with their behaviors. Specifically, I'm thinking about in Algeria during the Algiers Civil War. There were a lot of police officers who had engaged in torturing prisoners of war and felt disgusted with themselves. But it also, they developed friendships and relationships sometimes with the people that they were hurting. And so it's just very, very complicated and weird. But this is why just leave is not realistic advice. This is why. It's because there has been a cycle that's been going on and pounding into a person's nervous system that is literally expanding and softening. And I will say, not all abusers have personality disorders. In fact, most abusers do not have personality disorders, which is why I have faith that most human beings are healable. But there are cases where there are people who are legitimately predatory and actively doing these things to keep a person trapped. That brings us to thought reform. So thought reform is a classic piece of psychology on behavioral analysis. This was done, it was research done on prisoners of war in China, and basically the ways in which the POWs started off as enemies and slowly but surely lost their autonomy and just became vessels for the Maoist regime. And I'm saying this as a left-wing person, so I have no problem criticizing anything in our spectrum, the spectrum in which I exist. I have a lot of respect for Mao's writing. I also think that historical things are much more complicated than we want them to be. I also think that the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward created some of the greatest crimes against humanity that the world has ever seen. And I don't pretend that that's not a reality. Yeah, anytime somebody tells y'all that it's like, hey, like you're coming from a biased thing, it's like blah, blah, blah. I went to a presentation where a straight up socialist taught us about something where the first study was done on POWs under a literal communist regime. Anyways, thought reform. This is extremely important to identify on the systematic way in which people can lose their autonomy. The first is milieu control. And so that is where you restrict information. If you ever watch Fox News, for instance, you will hear terms like liberal media. Whereas if you go on CNN or MSNBC, whom I also have criticisms on, you will not hear terms like conservative media in reference to Fox News. And the reason why it's mindful to be aware of these slight pieces of information is that one of the information spaces, though coming from a neoliberal capitalist perspective and needs to be criticized from that perspective, it is not coming from a predatory lens of actively putting things out there to make sure that you distrust other information sources. So it's very subtle, but this is what we mean by milieu control. It is about restricting information. I will tell you all that this is a little complicated for me in particular in regards to fascist literature, because I do think that it's important to study all of that information and to know what's going on in there. But I do think that there is a certain amount of maturity at which you have to go through that material, especially as a white man, that without the proper tools, without being engaged as opposed to entangled from the first session, it can be easy to fall into these spaces. So I think it's important to not restrict information, but I understand where concerns are on certain pieces of information because I have concerns about things. It's like I don't necessarily think everybody needs access to instructions on how to make a bomb. But the point is that when we're talking about thought reform, it is an intentional effort to restrict information. So the next piece is mystical manipulation. And this is the use of signs to reinforce authority. So it's the, oh, look, I said this was going to happen. It happened. This can happen in subtle cases of a person playing active tricks or active manipulations to lie, make it seem like the person really just knew something. If you think about creepy boyfriends who maybe got into somebody's phone to learn about their interests and then show up with the person's things, that would be an example of mystical manipulation. Oh, I just happened to have the favorite thing that you wanted, even though I completely knew because I was snooping through your phone a little bit ago. Yeah, so these are the examples, but it can also be all the way to you say something, the abuser hits the person, says, I told you this was going to happen. That's the most kind of extreme example of mystical manipulation where it doesn't seem necessarily too mystical if a person's literally being hit, but when abuse, physical abuse happens, a person's mental capacities are lost. They're not responding the same way as when we're in our normal window of tolerance. So now we get to demand for purity, and this is the use of guilt to control behavior. Now, this is where we all need to be aware that fascists in particular are extremely good at marketing. They are extremely good at flipping terms. And these terms, if you know what they're doing, it's completely offensive. But if you are ignorant to it, it can sound like an either or. And that's really why we need to be cautious with when we analyze things. So the demand for purity, I can already hear all the right-wing people using the woke left is trying to demand such and such because you can't such and such anymore. And the real argument about this is that, number one, I don't believe anybody has ever been canceled in regards to the way that they are speaking about. People have lost their celebrity due to people not wanting any interest in them anymore because they're disgusted by what they do or what they've done. And it gets interpreted as some kind of woke mob story. But we're going to get into all of this. But this is really about pay attention to some of these terms being used as a flip. I'll give a really good example of fascists flipping a term. Black power came out of the Black liberation movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Black power was a creation of white supremacy in the fact that there was no need for black power. There would be no need for black power if there was not already white supremacy completely engulfing everything. And so what do the white supremacists do? They flip it. Black power. Oh, well, white power. It's the same thing. Not the same thing. But this is how idiots, centrists, people oblivious to their surroundings, both siders. Yeah, all lives matter, straight pride, all of it. We've heard this so many times. We have heard this so many times. Citizens and their property. That was used during slavery. Citizens and their property. So, states' rights. But anyways, that's demand for purity is not talking about accountability. It is about rigid guidelines on how you are supposed to be. I know of many women who have reported people telling them when they can smile and when they can't smile. And they have to know when it is. And if they don't, they have failed the purity test. Yes, so the next point is confession. This is exploiting personal faults. I think I explained it already. Sacred science. So this is where you treat the belief as unquestionable. The reason why it says sacred science cannot be sacred and something sacred cannot be scientific. And it's a kind of a clever wordplay by a social scientist. But the point of it is that science is something that is observable and sacred is something that is felt and unexplainable. And so you have a sacred science, meaning that the way that this is supposed to be is just the way it is. Gay people are going to hell. They're born that way due to a demon. They're going to hell. That's an example of sacred science. I just watched a documentary a couple years ago now, but on the possible misinterpretations of the like 3 or 4 specific verses that bigots use to justify their homophobia or their transphobia. But this is what sacred science means. It is just the belief is unquestionable. I actually experienced this in my own church with the example given earlier. What is a Catholic? Oh, it doesn't really matter. Catholics aren't Christian. Okay. Loading the language. So this is using jargon to limit critical thinking. It gets a little confusing sometimes, I think, to read some of the terms that come out of the social sciences and not get them confused with some of the nonsense put out by con artists, because they can sound complicated at the same time. But a really good example of loading the language that helped me kind of understand this concept is if you're familiar with a gentleman goes by the name Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, very well known and respected, quote unquote, in his field. Worked at Harvard. I believe he was at McGill. He was actually published. He was actually considered an expert in personalities and blah, 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 blah. Somehow around 2016, he got famous because he was speaking out against trans people. And it was a complete misrepresentation of Bill C-16, which was a Canadian bill, which was basically adding transgender people as a protected class. So it meant that if you harassed a person on basis of being trans, that could be included in charges. To date, there has still never been anybody charged with this additional bill. But anyways, Jordan Peterson got famous due to that. But while he got famous, he started talking like a lot of psycho jargon and became really, really, really famous, really rich, really just unbelievably rich with some of the stuff. And I will be frank with you all, I never liked him, but I bought it at the beginning, being like, he's smart. Like, I don't like where he's getting to, but I see he's a smart guy. The point of why I'm bringing this gentleman up is when I became a therapist and actually learned how to read the literature of which this gentleman was spewing, it became very clear that he was using his expertise as a personality psychologist and researcher as a mask to spew Jungian pseudoscience, like archetypal philosophical things. And now I will tell you all that I have no beef with Jung in general in regards to a lot of the concepts. They're very useful in hospice care. They're very useful in for communicating large concepts. They're very useful for framing. I know some Jungian therapists who are trained, went to the psychoanalyst school in Switzerland. And they're not true believers. They see it more as a philosophical lens to do therapy through. And blah, blah, blah. I say all of this to it took a very long time to figure out that Jordan Peterson was full of garbage when he was talking about Jung, because he would talk about these pseudo-philosophical things that are questionable within Jungian psychology, and he would treat it as if it was fact. But then if you would question it, he would then lean on his credentials as a published psychologist. And so this is an example of loading the language. He speaks overly complicated. It's a word salad is a way you might hear it, but it's when a person does not get to the point. It's over talking but not getting to a landing point. And extremely good loaders of language can actually make you feel like you heard a lot and nothing was even said. Doctrine over people. This is where you ignore experiences that challenge the belief. Hey, so and so, the priest just did this thing in the back room with me. That didn't happen to you. That's not, he's a good man. Doctrine over person. And then dispensing of existence. This is for people who are rejecting the group. They are completely rejected from the group eventually. Oftentimes cults, what we would call a cult, they go through what's called a purge, because a way to make sure people are controllable, they have to keep the group smaller, because the larger it gets, the harder it is to manage. And so the leaders will literally start gossiping and rumors to get people out that they don't like, and they'll just trim people out. And it's a way to keep the insiders in more rigidly trauma bonded, while also opening it up so new membership can come in. Very, very creepy stuff, to be super frank. So if we think of thought reform as the scientific explanation of brainwashing, like you think of brainwashing, that's a colloquial term. There's no such thing really as brainwashing. But if you were to think of what we're talking about, it's thought reform. So if that was brainwashing, the concept of taking over a person's mind, then we would get to the next concept, which would be mind control. But the actual scientific term is bounded choice. And this is broken into 4 key categories. There is a charismatic authority. There is a transcendent belief system. There are systems of control, and there are systems of influence. So let me explain how that works. So there's always, in these kinds of groups, there's always some kind of charismatic authority. There's an emotional bond with the leader or the authority. You see this with Mr. President. You see this with Mr. Musk. You see this with a lot of celebrities. You see this with Bill Cosby, with R. Kelly. But there is some kind of charismatic authority in which the focus is directed towards. Then there is a transcendent belief system, and this is how you actually operate. This is the worldview of which everything functions. If you are in, let's say, a political cult, this political ideology is going to change the world, whatever that political ideology is. If you're in a religious high control group, we need to spread this word to save the world, or we are the only people who are going to be saved. So transcendent belief system is the environment in which you are projecting into your beliefs into it. Then there are systems of control, and these are the mechanisms that enforce the rules and regulations. So these are, in some high control groups, hey, you have to check in with me on what food you're eating. Food is a major mechanism of control. A lot of people make rational choices, but if you have an abuser who has slowly chiseled you down to now you're only eating 500 calories a day and working 18 hours a day, doing mindless labor, pretty easy to control you. And so the systems of control will be those sorts of rules, or those sorts of like, oh, you did this thing, you now owe me $5. Or, oh, you did this thing, we can't go to step 2 because you did this thing and now we're stuck in step 1. So it's the rules and regulations. And then systems of influence, and these are the structures that actually guide and shape the individual beliefs and values. This is the narratives that you follow. Make America great again. Blood in, blood out. I hope you all see that I'm trying to like pull from many groups so that you can see the behavior pattern. This is not about the ideology. This is about the behavior pattern. So here is a list of tactics that are used by abusers and manipulators. I'm just going to read them all. Love bombing. This is excessive praise to build dependency. Isolation, cutting people off from external support. Surveillance, monitoring behavior to instill fear. Gaslighting, undermining victims' sense of reality. Micromanaging, the controlling of daily life decisions. Now this is the big one. Sleep deprivation and exhaustion, weakening resistance to control. A lot of people, their first cult weekend they go to, it's like 5 days long, and they just keep you awake those 5 days. So yeah, you would not join a cult. But you in 5 days who didn't know that you were going to get worn out, you might sign up for the next session pretty easy. Or you might accept some of the weirder stuff that they start to do. Yeah, double binds. This is where you're stuck in a situation that creates conflicting demands, where an individual is trapped in a no-win situation. I mean, the worst you can think about is, which child do you want me to hit? I don't want you to hit either of my children, but I really don't want you to hit the smaller one. So that's a double bind. Thought-terminating cliches, this using simplistic phrases to shut down critical thinking and prevent questioning. In my last cult recovery group, there was a particularly large amount of ex-Scientologists involved, and there was one moment where one person was sharing and somebody said the term A is A plus A is A is A, and they just said this thing, and all the other ones like, oh yeah, and like they all started to say it. And it was, I was as the therapist in there, it was like, all right, I don't know what that is, but like I know what that is. And so an example of a thought terminating cliche that we use all the time is, it is what it is. You know how it goes. It's like, so yeah, how many of you have had that family member who's just awful to be around and the other people go, it is what it is? It's a thought terminating cliche. I really don't like the thing this person's doing. This person's like, this is actually not okay what this person is doing. Yeah. All right. Anyways, financial control restricts access to money, creating financial dependency and limiting escape options, restricting access to resources. Sexual coercion. There are really two ways that this is utilized, but either pressuring a person into unwanted sexual activities to exert control, or utilizing intimacy as a leverage. And then we have discrediting and triangulation. Discrediting is where you sabotage the victim's reputation. You make it harder for them to seek help or to be believed. And triangulation is when a perpetrator involves third parties to create competition or division, reinforcing the abuser's control. This is the person said the one thing to so-and-so, now so-and-so comes and talks to you. Hey, you really need to not do this thing because so-and-so, hey, that's not really what's happening. Well, so-and-so said you didn't do this. Actually, another person shows up. Actually, yeah, I heard this thing too. That's triangulation. These are techniques and tactics. This last one, be cautious. I'm always cautious with teaching psychological terms to people who are not board certified mental health professionals, just because one of the things that happens whenever you learn psychology terms in the beginning is everything you learn, you go, oh, I have that. I've seen that. I know that. That person has that. That person. So just be cautious. Be cautious. I'm teaching these terms to stimulate knowledge, to learn things, but be aware, use some wisdom that if you are not a board certified or licensed mental health professional, you cannot diagnose. So use these terms very cautiously. But DARVO, this is a concept called deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. This is the, hey, I don't like that you speak to all of us this way in this setting. You all ganged up on me, and I can't live with this anymore. I'm disgusted by your behavior. In fact, I'm leaving now. That's Darvo. So now, this is why I gave the preemptive psychological terms are complicated, but because we cannot go around diagnosing people. But personality disorders are a long-term pattern of thinking, feeling, and behavior that is rigid, maladaptive, and causes ongoing problems within relationships. There's a specific category in the DSM, which is our handy-dandy psychology Bible, that has all the diagnoses and gets updated every few years. But there's a specific cluster under the personality disorders called Cluster B. And the DSM category for personality disorders, these are personality disorders that are marked by dramatic, emotionally intense, and often conflict-driven behavior. And so, unfortunately, the people with these disorders, who struggle with these disorders, do have some of the largest histories of abuse. But they do come in a couple of different ways. But antisocial personality disorder, this is really when a person displays consistent problematic behavior, not pro-social behavior. So they violate others' rights, they may be deceitful, reckless, display violent behavior, lack of remorse. It's very small prevalence, maybe 0.2% of the population actually has this kind of a disorder. Then there's borderline personality disorder, and this is probably the most common, at least in regards to the year 2025. But this is intense mood instability, intense unstable relationships, an intense fear of abandonment. Self-harm can be common, or suicidal behaviors. Histrionic personality disorder, this is excessive attention seeking, dramatic emotional exaggeration, inappropriate seduction. And finally, we get to narcissistic personality disorder, and this is really grandiosity, a need for admiration, lack of empathy, manipulative and demanding behavior for self-centeredness. Now, again, these are not firm categories. Some people can display different behaviors. And also, not every antisocial personality or antisocial behavior that you witness in your life is coming from a person with a personality disorder. I will tell you all that there was one person that I have met in the prison system who I am comfortable saying is very likely to have antisocial personality disorder. But the reason I point out that I can name one person in my mind, like very confidently, is that is in prison. There are thousands of people in prison. And I met one that I can confidently say displayed these sorts of behavior traits. So it is not common, but it is very common in the problematic people in the world, I guess is the way to put it. Types of high control groups. This is just to really think about it, but ideological cults. This can be religious groups or spiritual groups, political groups, personality cults, media or disinformation networks, parasocial relationships, like the relationships people have with like newscasters or internet celebrities, conspiracy movements like QAnon. These are ideological cults. And then there's commercial cults, which are maybe multi-level marketing, pyramid schemes, financial scams, Ponzi schemes, toxic workplaces, places where it demands extreme loyalty or extreme compliance, extreme time demand, rigid rules in the office, those sorts of things. Community-based cults. This is like niche communities, insular groups with rigid ideological control, social clubs, groups that enforce strict behavioral expectations. Think the Harlem, or not the Harlem, sorry, the Hell's Angels, or any of these types of groups. Domestic and family cults. This is abusive families and guardians, control through emotional, psychological, physical abuse, abusive relationships, domination through coercion and dependency, stalking. To be honest, I would put in this kind of category. They're displaying similar behaviors, the stalker. Somebody who's born into a cult, indoctrination from childhood. The one that I have the most trouble with as a clinician is the troubled teen industry. I've had a couple of people come from that world, and I'm a parent, I don't know, that one makes me gross. Like, I have trouble with troubled teen industry. They all bother me, but that one bothers me a lot. Political violence and paramilitary cults. This is autocrats, colonial or imperial forces, ethno-nationalist militias, narco-militias or narco-mercenaries, even revolutionary groups. Therapeutic or wellness cults like pseudoscience groups or quackery groups, self-help productivity cults like where they pressure followers into extreme self-improvement regimens, therapy or wellness cults. This is manipulative use of psychological health and practices. And then there's informal or underground economies. This is gangs, organized syndicates, human trafficking networks, street gangs, deputy gangs, which is the horrifying phenomenon of white supremacist gangs that form within police departments. They get tattoos and everything. It's a real thing. Look up the Punishers in LAPD. It's great stuff. But fraud or scamming rings. So, cool. I'm going to try to zoom through this next part, but part 2 is understanding fascism. And I think I can get through it in about 10 minutes. The first thing I actually want to speak about is when we consider politics, we consider the left and the right spectrum. And I would like us to, when we are liberation practitioners, to start to disregard that way of thinking. Now, of course, we can still use left-wing and right-wing and centrist and liberal and conservative. These are all words that can be used. But for the framing of how this workshop is meant to operate is that there is the three-way fight. And so the three-way fight, it is that there was not a conflict between left and right in the 20th century, but it's a framework that there were three social forces that were really in competition with one another. And a lot of these social forces' behavior is what we are still dealing with on a large scale. Now, social forces are confusing because they are not a literal thing. You cannot check the weather on the social forces, but this is about behavior patterns, recognizable behavior patterns. And so the way to think about this is that there are two descriptors of each category. So the first is reactionary chauvinism. So reactionary describes a political orientation that seeks to reverse social change and restore or preserve hierarchical social orders perceived as traditional or natural. So it has a lot of opposition to egalitarian movements, has a defense of hierarchy, whether that be racial, gender, national, religious. There is a nostalgia for an imagined past and a hostility towards modern pluralism. So reactionary politics are defined by looking backwards. If you think of it as in directional language, they are looking backwards. They are obsessed with something in the back, something in the past. So chauvinism, a lot of times we think of it as male chauvinism, which is a type of chauvinism. But chauvinism is an ideology of aggressive superiority, asserting that a particular group, nation, race, gender, religion, is inherently better and therefore entitled to dominance. So you can be a racial chauvinist. You can be a religious chauvinist. You can be a gender chauvinist. Key features: in-group supremacy, dehumanization of outsiders, justification of exclusion or violence, often fused with nationalism, often fused with patriarchy. Chauvinism supplies emotional fuel for emotional movements. So reactionary chauvinism is a superiority complex that is obsessed with the past. And this makes it a little easier to look at things like trans-exclusive reactionary feminists, also known as TERFs, or as they go by, gender-critical feminists. They use all the language of feminism, but they are excluding trans people as a behavior. This is how I feel about Zionism, to be perfectly frank. It is an ethno-nationalist ideology that is put forward by extreme right Christians in the United States. They are the primary supporters of that movement. But the point is, we can see this kind of behavior across any demographic. There are reactionary chauvinist movements within what we would call the left wing. There's a really horrifying case of a guy named Caleb Maupin, who some left-wing, air quotes, thinker who turned out to be a serial abuser with all of his followers, and also his ideas are nonsense, to be perfectly frank. He's a con artist just like many of the others. So then we get to neoliberal capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production, land, factories, technology are privately owned, goods and services are produced for profit, and labor is sold on the market for wages. And it's all about private property, wage labor, profit motive, market exchange, and capital accumulation. And then neoliberal, which is a modern political economic doctrine that seeks to extend market logic to all areas of life. So arguing that competition and privatization are the most efficient ways to organize society. Deregulation, privatization, free trade, reduced social welfare, strong protection of capital, even if it's through state power. So this is how people like Ronald Reagan can justify using the state strength to strengthen Wall Street while destroying all these social safety nets. So if we look at these social forces, you can see how people are operating and how people can even move. I would make the argument that Elon Musk was pretending to operate through a neoliberal capitalist model, but has actually been operating through a reactionary chauvinist worldview the whole time. Anyways, then we get to revolutionary socialism. And, I do not want to make it seem like this is the end all be all, but this is just to look at identifying where this course is coming from. Just to be, we got to be self-aware. I am coming from this social force. This is where I resonate. I don't resonate as a liberal. I resonate as a revolutionary socialist, to be frank. But to break these two terms down, socialism is an economic and political tradition advocating for the means of production to be collectively owned and democratically controlled rather than privately owned for profit. So collective social ownership, production for use, not for profit, reduction or abolition of class exploitation, and an emphasis on economic democracy. So socialism is a broad family of theories and practices, not a single model. And then revolutionary, it simply describes a strategy or orientation that seeks fundamental structural change to society. So breaking existing power structures, aiming to transform economic, political, and social relations, and arising when reform is seen as insufficient or impossible. So if you think about it as this, kind of like a triangle, instead of the left-right spectrum, this is how we think about it in the course. So fascism is probably the most, or one of the most extreme forms of reactionary chauvinism. So fascism is a mass politics of authoritarian national renewal that builds unity through fear and scapegoating partners with existing elites, strips democratic rights, and uses organized violence, the street violence to paramilitary violence to full military, to crush opponents and enforce hierarchy and purity. So politics is solely us versus them. Narratives center on a mythological past. A strong man is treated as the nation itself, though it is interesting with people like Marine Le Pen popping in. It's like maybe even the fascists are starting. We need to say strong person is treated. I don't know, whatever. But violence is justified as necessary or purifying. rights, courts, and elections are hollowed out in the name of security, and economic and institutional elites fall into line. I did not write this list in 2025. This came from Robert O. Paxton's 2006 book, The Anatomy of Fascism, on Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. So I didn't come up with any of those terms. He came up with this brilliant concept called the 5 stages of fascism. So historian and scholar Robert Paxton argues that fascism is not a fixed ideology, but a political process that evolves through identifiable stages. In this model, fascism, it's step by step. It often is in cooperation of those who believe they can control or benefit from it. So the first thing to notice is that there is an intellectual exploration. So this is when reactionary and chauvinistic ideas begin to circulate in intellectual or cultural or political circles. Now, just to be very clear in our circumstance, I do not want to get into the history necessarily of American fascism and all of it. We are only going to reference the current circumstance post-2025 just for example making. But if you remember in 2015, there was the rise of the alt-right, which was really the intellectual exploration of this. This was when a lot of internet culture started toying with reactionary and chauvinistic ideas. It includes anxieties about national decline. There's always an anti-immigration sentiment, and there is attacks on democratic norms. Public figures may begin directing outrage towards immigrants or women or democracy itself. And then we have rooting into politics. So you have first the conceptualizing of fascism, but then you have the rooting in politics. And this is where fascist movements actually gain traction. And this can happen both electorally and on the streets. So electorally, you get more far-right people elected, whereas on the streets, you get groups like the Proud Boys or groups like the Oath Keepers starting to form. So yeah, paramilitary, street violence, hate speech becomes normalized, public intimidation begins to happen. That gets to the legitimation by elites. So fascists gain support or tolerance from established institutions, business leaders, party leaders, political leaders, media outlets, because they see the fascist as a useful tool. So YouTube media figures might align, for instance, with a fascist movement because it is giving them traction for money. And so they don't necessarily believe in the thing that the fascist is spreading, but they're legitimizing it because the outrage gets them money. So they're legitimizing it that way. So then we get into seizure of power. And this is where the fascists actually enter government, often through legal means, often elections, appointments, alliances, and they erode democratic systems from within. So this is undermining democratic institutions, the use of emergency powers, and the use of legal declarations. That finally gets to the exercise and radicalization of power. So once in control, fascists escalate repression, they attack civil liberties, they target marginalized group, they deploy state violence. I would say we are in the midst of somewhere between 4 and 5 right now, which is very scary because we used to not be there. I've been following this the whole time and have been using this model as a measuring stick, to be very frank. And it literally feels like a playbook. Now, a really good counter to this, because Robert O. Paxton is the academic. He's a Columbia social theorist and social psychologist and anthropologist. So I also like to apply a radical theory. This comes from George L. Jackson, and he was a revolutionary theorist and political prisoner. He argued in his book, Blood in My Eye, that fascism is an adaptive, evolving process that is embedded within capitalism. So he identifies 3 distinct phases that demonstrate how fascism adapts to changing conditions and how it appears differently across racial, gender, and class lines. So to give an argument, a white person in 1962 America was not necessarily living in a fascist state, but a black person living in 1962 America under Jim Crow laws was living in a fascist state. So you can literally be living next to each other. Let's have a hypothetical white person and black person live house across the street from each other, but under Jim Crow laws. One of them lives in fascism, the other does not. So the three phases of fascism from this perspective are fascists when they're out of power. So this is the fascist movements position themselves as revolutionary and subversive. They often use anti-capitalist language. They will use socialist language but use anti-socialist rhetoric. And they exploit societal unrest to gain support and present themselves as champions. So then we get into in power but not secure. So this is once fascist elements have actually ascended to power, they face instability and potential threats to their authority. Where are we right now? The ruling class employs the state apparatus to suppress opposition, targeting vanguard parties, targeting progressive movements, targeting marginalized communities, all through overt repression, censorship, and the curtailment of civil liberties. Consider when they went after Jimmy Kimmel. I don't want to sit here and talk about free speech rights of a multimillionaire TV star who's been in the public circle for decades. That's not like where my point is. I'm not going, oh, poor Jimmy Kimmel lost his show. It is, oh my God, the state is going after people at that level now. And that is an issue. So in power and secure. And this is when fascist regimes have solidified their control. They do permit certain amounts of dissent. We're not there right now. But George Jackson wrote this because he was incarcerated for stealing $70, and he was incarcerated for a year to life. That was his prison sentence. He was also murdered by prison guards at age 39, but he came up with this theory while incarcerated. There's another concept, and this is more about identifying behavioral traits, and this is fascism, and I'm just going to read these, but this is cult of tradition, idealizing a mythic past while rejecting modernity. There's the rejection of modernism. There is action for action's sake, which is valuing violence or impulsive behavior over thoughtful deliberation. This is Donald Trump coming up with all his names. You know, all his, Pocahontas, whatever. Disagreement is treason, branding critics as enemies of the nation. Fear of difference, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. The thing that is so horrifying to me when rereading a lot of the literature about Nazi Germany in particular is reading the translations on how the Jewish people were spoken about, because we hear about, yes, the Jewish people, but what we don't talk about is the Polish Jewish people. That was the first group that was targeted, and they were spoken about the exact same way that the Trump administration and people in that area are speaking about brown immigrants, Arabic and Hispanic. That is exactly how they're speaking. There is a frustrated middle class mobilizing downwardly mobile citizens against scapegoats. There's an obsession with conspiracy. Everything is a conspiracy. It does not mean conspiracy theories do not exist. But there is a belief that secret plots by elites and minorities all the time. Y'all, when the QAnon guy is right in front of you in the Oval Office and you're still like, I don't know who it is. It's like, I don't know what to tell y'all. Yeah, pacifism is weakness. Sorry, skip one. Enemies are both strong and weak. Immigrants are stealing your job, but they are also lazy, and they also steal everything off the social safety net, but they also are violent criminals. Like they're capable of so many things. The Tutsis run everything in the government, but they're also sexually promiscuous and have no money. Contempt for the weak, glorifying cruelty and domination. Machismo and gun obsession. This was written by Umberto Eco in the 1990s. Not about the United States. This stuff is identifiable, y'all. Hero worship. Devotion to a strong man or a mythic savior figure. Selective populism. That is all right-wing populism, just so you know. Claiming to speak for the real people while excluding others. If you ever hear somebody use the term the white working class, I am saying this as a pacifist. You can gently put your hand against their face and push it slightly. That was my gentle way of saying slap them. I'm being funny, not funny. But yeah, if you ever hear anybody say white working class, they are part of selective populism. Y'all, the working class is the working class. Like, there should not be that kind of division. That's what we need to be doing as our workers. We need to be considering these pieces on what selective populism is. I really like this group of workers, but not transgender workers. And then newspeak. This is reducing complex thought through simplistic emotional language. Mega, make America great again. Keep America great. All right, so finally, this is the concept that I really want you to internalize for next week. Because next week, a big topic on caste and race, or racial caste and gender caste and class systems is the imperial boomerang. So the concept I really want you to internalize before next week is colonialism is exported fascism. And fascism is imported colonialism. What the Germans did to the Herreras and the Namanik was no different than what they did to the Roma, the Slavs, and the Jews. It was just, the difference was, one was a group of others that were outside over there in Africa. So that was colonialism. They had camps, they executed people, mass genocide of two groups of people. The only difference is that it was directed to other people, whereas when it became fascism, it was, wait, those other people, they live amongst us. So that is how this works. The seventh thesis on militant anti-fascism and definition of fascism. It's important to understand what fascism is. Fascism is different than other forms of totalitarianism and other forms of authoritarianism. There is an argument on Stalin is a totalitarian tyrant, but not a fascist, because his ideology is not focused on a mythological past, and his ideology is not focused on narrative building. So that is the argument on why he does not fit into fascism. Whereas Mussolini's fascism returned to Rome. Hitler's fascism returned to Germany. Mosley's fascism from England, he never made it to power, thankfully, but his entire thing, we need to return to the great British Empire. What's the United States version of that? Make America great again. So it's good to understand what fascism is. The second part is the far-right ecological niche. So fascist movements emerge within broader far-right, which rejects the legitimacy of established political systems and supports social and economic inequalities. Notice how much easier it is getting for Republicans to be anti-Semitic. Eventually, you just get closer and closer to the end result of full fascism. That is where this leads. So then, understanding the three-way fight, that militant anti-fascism engages in a three-way fight, because not only do we have to deal with the ridiculousness of the far-right insurgencies, but we got to deal with the bourgeois and the corporations and the capitalists and we really need to go. That's my impression of all neoliberal capitalists. Yeah, anyways. Social relations, dependency. Far-right and fascist groups depend on specific social context, particularly in relation to settler colonialism, which includes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and indigenous dispossession. Fascism always needs a genocide to make it work. It doesn't always happen where you live, but it is happening. And it doesn't always have to be mass killing. We're getting into all of that next week. System loyalty versus system oppositional. It's important to identify what kind of far-right movement you might be seeing or witnessing, because they may be system loyal or system oppositional, depending on their perception on advancing white supremacy. This is why a lot of street gangs were white supremacists. This is why a lot of when you look through a social class lens, why a lot of poverty-stricken white men, when they fall into the same behavior patterns that poverty-stricken Black and Hispanic men may fall into, they fall into white supremacist groups, and that is a system oppositional group. Whereas when the fascists gain power, when there's actually a class, a social class, so people from the middle class or the elite class who are fascists start to get there, they are system loyal, if that makes any sense. And even then they'll use system oppositional language, but they're actually system loyal to their behavior, if you look at things like Doge. And then there's Revolutionary Horizon. This is anti-fascist organizing requires a revolutionary horizon, which is addressing the root causes of fascism, which includes capitalism, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. And then diversity of tactics. Militant anti-fascism advocates for a diversity of tactics to disrupt far-right organizing and raise the cost of fascist action. The most important thing, y'all, beware of the fascist impulse. It's an expression from the three-way fight, underscoring the importance to maintain vigilance and caution against the tendencies and inclinations that align with fascist ideologies. It serves as a critical reminder that elements of fascist thinking and behavior can surface in any context, urging activists to remain alert to such proclivities to stave off the ascent of authoritarianism and oppressive ideologies. And with all of that, woo! For next week, it's continuing the educational practices and transformational practices, but we're going to be covering caste and class. And again, I'll leave this up for a moment, but this course workshop is Workshop 0. It's completely free. It will always be free. I want it to be available for all folks at all times as I develop this into a professional course. But that being said, it does take time, and time is always more useful when there's funds. So, if you feel you are able to, you can donate to any of these links. And of course, stay connected by checking out my website, dorianwallace.com, or Substack, dorianwallace.substack.com. And with that, thank you so much.